This is Space Minds by Space News. In this episode, co-host David Ariosto talks with Mamta Patel, Nagaraja, NASA's former associate chief scientist. Our hosts then discuss the latest news, including the debate on satellite refueling, Rocket Lab's Neutron launch vehicle, and the re-entry into Earth's atmosphere of the Soviet-era Venus-Venera lander.
Mamta, it is a pleasure to have you on the show, especially now in regard to all these historic proposed cuts to NASA, especially when it comes to NASA science. So you were sort of an early casualty in a lot of this. You worked as NASA's Associate Chief Scientist for Exploration and Applied Research. I told you before the show I wasn't going to give your title, but now here I just did.
You got to.
Just tell me what that means. Tell me what you actually did at NASA.
Sure, yeah. So this is one of those roles that you definitely take as you have established some experience in the agency, and then you get to a point where you can serve an advisory role. So we were the administrator's independent science team. And I say independent because there's the team that actually does the science and funds the science. They're the ones who come up with the missions or the areas they need to get missions, and then they go out and put out the funding to get those missions. And they have a vested interest monetarily and otherwise in those missions. We are a group of scientists who spent many years in those organizations, but left to try to fulfill a different role the agency needed. In this case, it was to advise the administrator when, let's say, there are tough decisions being made. For example, let's say there is a big budget cut and the administrator needs to figure out, well, which missions am I going to get rid of? They're all important. They all serve the NASA mission, the overall mission. So he would come to our office and say, I really need to know what the pros and cons are of the missions and which ones are the ones that we need to consider for cutting. And so we would come in, we don't have any stake in the game because we don't fund any of the missions in that particular office. And we come in with our science hat on only, and we'd give him the pros and cons of the various missions that he's looking for, and then let him make the ultimate decision of what's going to be cut along with his science leadership.
Give me an example of that, because I think the general public I think has a general sense of what NASA does, and from the science side. I mean, they look at the International Space Station, they look at James Webb, and they get a sense of some of particularly the imagery that comes out of that. But I think more broadly speaking, the nature of the agency has sort of like shifted and waned in different ways over the years, and yet now seems very, very different. So I'm like wondering if you can kind of give us a little bit of a context in terms of those internal decisions that were happening before we get to the current state.
Yeah, and while I was serving, which that was my last role, and I was only in it for a couple of years, so I didn't actually have to make that tough
Yeah.
display of information for the administrator. We didn't actually have to cut while I was there, but I'll give you a similar example and what was prioritization. And we did actually have to go through this. So we got into a position on the International Space Station where the time that the crew had to work on actual science was becoming really full. I mean, the amount of science being done on the space station is incredible at this time. And it got to the point where we had much more science than we had crew hours and other resources for. And so the ISS team reached out to us and said, we really need some help at the agency level, up at the top, in going through this prioritization and understanding whose needs are what and how do we prioritize that when everyone's needs are important. And the two big players on the space station are the biological and physical sciences team and the human research program. But then there's a bunch of smaller ones that are very important. In space manufacturing is the one that I was a big proponent of because, yeah, I mean, there's so much value and it's a very small investment. So just being able to prioritize those hours so that all of the science gets done, but you leave enough room, or I should say most of the science, you have to prioritize which science, but you leave enough room to fill in the gaps with what's coming next. What should we be looking at? And so we went through this whole scheme of trying to help the agency prioritize with the space station.
I think in that context, I think this is where I find this so fascinating, because your role essentially, particularly when it comes to the International Space Station and all the science that happens there, is almost emblematic of a kind of a broader paradigm shift that the agency is facing altogether, in the sense that the ISS is retiring. You have all these commercial space stations that are coming on orbit. but there are different questions that are asked of commercial space stations relative to the International Space Station,
Yeah.
not least of which are financial considerations. Because, from the folks that I've talked to, a lot of people are very excited about this in terms of pharmaceutical research and all these other things that have existing markets back on Earth. And yet ISS could prioritize things perhaps through your office that didn't necessarily have that immediate financial bottom line, but were valuable for the sake of science itself. Just explain, is that accurate? Is that a fair framing, first of all?
I think it's a fair framing. Sure.
So, like, eh, what does that represent then, as we start to push into this commercial age and maybe push away a little bit from a top-down approach that we've seen thus far?
Yeah, you mean what is the future of commercial
Yeah,
space?
I guess like when decisions start coming out of the hands of those at NASA and into the
Uh,
hands of those
Ah,
and NASA is being made more of a client than an architect necessarily within the kind of broader structure of the
yeah,
burgeoning space economy. Like that seems different.
absolutely. Yeah. So those were some of the conversations our office also helped the ISS program in terms of transitioning into more of a client perspective than the one driving, right? We no longer, in the future, when we have these commercial space stations, we no longer are the one who have made the investment. Now we're working with teams who have made their own investment and trying to become a customer of theirs. Yeah, so we did spend a lot of time trying to figure out what that looks like. We put out a strategy, the agency did. Now that I'm out of the agency, I'm having a hard time separating from the word we. I no longer am with
Well,
NASA.
yeah,
For anyone who's
maybe
listening.
we should get right into that because I like
Yeah,
that's actually something that I want to kind of get to in a little bit more granular detail.
yeah,
Tell
yeah.
me about that day or sort of the moment that you learned that you were out of a job.
Yeah, it was a surprise. It was March 10th. I guess that date will never exit my memory, only because, gosh, David, I am that little girl who grew up in a small town out in West Texas and dreamed big, right? This was in the era of the 1980s. The space shuttle was at its oh gosh, it's magical beginnings almost. And it
Mhm.
had captured this entire generation of people just like me who could not wait to rocket into space. It was such a transformative period in space flight. And I was a little kid in that era. And so I grew up thinking, I'm going to fly on that rocket one day. And that was my passion. And that was what drove me. This little girl, first generation American, immigrant parents, sort of that my parents came here because in India, I would have never had that opportunity. And I was going to make good. Dang it. I was going to make good on the sacrifices that they had made
Mhm.
to give me this opportunity. So that was sort of the beginning. So for me, this was never a job. For many of us who get to NASA, it was never a job. So many kids dream of the skies. Most of us outgrow that. And a very small portion of us become obsessed with it. And I was in that small portion. Made my way to NASA. So for that day to come, it was unexpected. We had, if I mean, we're living it right now. This was 3 months. At that time, it had been about a month of wild change. I mean, no matter which side of the aisle you sit on, it is transformative. Whatever is happening right now is absolutely transforming our nation and our foothold in science and technology from my perspective. Um, so we were already kind of wondering, how are they going to do this? Are they going to cut us? There was lots of rumblings coming into that day, but certainly I didn't think I was walking into a meeting where they said, you're no longer going to be a NASA employee. But it was, I mean, as soon as we came in, we got an invite that morning on our calendar. We did not know ahead of time that it was coming. There wasn't much context to it. You couldn't see the people that had been invited to it. We thought it was our boss, the chief scientist, who was going to tell us perhaps what she thought the future of the office was going to be. That's really what we thought it was going to be. But instead, it was one of the top persons in HR, one of the top ranking members of the administrators team. We had no administrator at that time, still don't. So it was one of the higher ranking officials, and it was pretty quick, David. They
Yeah,
said, what they told us was we have large scale reductions in force planned, and you are part of that.
right.
I no longer want, I wonder now, are we going to have large scale reductions? I hope not. I'm not one of those people who got let go that hopes, oh man, I hope they get rid of a lot more. I mean, I hope they don't. I
Yeah.
believe in the mission of the agency, even though in the end it wasn't it's not the ending I would have written for myself. I believe in the mission and I believe in space flight. I hope to contribute to it from the other side now. But I hope
Well,
that the agency, oh, go ahead.
I highly doubt that is the end of your story when it comes to space flight. The way I actually became aware of you
Yeah,
was through LinkedIn, and I think you had posted a photo of your head down
yeah,
in front of a NASA sign. And you know that there's a lot of folks that are going through something somewhat similar.
yeah.
Um, I think there's another question though that comes out of this in the sense that is there a sense that scientists at NASA and those who have been let go, that they're entering the free market now in a way that we just haven't seen before? And I wonder what that means in sort of the broader context of the commercial sector, what it means in the broader context of potentially international competition. You know, you just have a lot of people with a very deep knowledge that are now sort of free agents in this you know,
Yeah.
burgeoning new economy.
I love this idea of free agents in STEM. It's kind of cool, especially
Mhm.
from the sports side of me. I love sports also. Yeah, I think that's exactly what you're going to see from NASA, not so much because the number of scientists let go from NASA is very small. There were two of us in the office of the chief scientist who were in scientific roles. But if we look at the president's budget, at least what was leaked, the if Congress holds to the PBR, which they haven't in the past necessarily,
Yeah.
then I do think you're going to have this onslaught of really well-versed, deep knowledge base of scientists coming onto the market. You are seeing it in public health from HHS. Um, but from
Well,
NASA, we haven't seen
you
it
make a
yet.
good point, though. I mean, in the context that, you know, the power of the purse is held within the legislative branch,
Yeah.
kind of in a little bit of a new era here in terms of
Yeah.
where the power dynamics are actually playing out. So I think that's a question mark. There's a question of a pivot that we saw in that skinny budget with SLS and Orion being phased out, and you know, and you saw a lot during those Jerry Eisman hearings. You saw a lot of pushback from those like Senator Ted Cruz.
Yep.
So, you know, there seems to be a lot happening now politically behind the scenes in terms of the to and fro, the political hot potato that kind of gets tossed around when and you know anytime budget conversations come up with NASA, which is not new, but
Right.
this does feel new in the context of cuts and the nature of what that means long term. And I wonder if you can address because there are some that say that and there's a question mark here, and I think that maybe there's a legitimate question to be asked in the context of NASA for years and years has operated with large budgets, some of which are practical, have practical applications, some of which are based more on exploration. But you know, for those champions of this decision, they might say, well, you know, is that really the best use of taxpayer dollars? And I wonder how you would respond to something like that.
Yeah, so my one of my favorite things that I've learned over my 2 decades plus at NASA is how much of our technology comes right back to people. How much
Mm.
of it really comes back to benefit here on Earth. And I think what we have to think about is when you are trying to solve a problem, that is so different than the problems we have on Earth. You have to innovate because the answer doesn't exist. You have to develop technologies that do not exist. And then the question is, how do those technologies come back to us? So I'll give you one that's rooted in the early space era, but it's something that most of us can really relate to. And it's one that I learned when I did a talk at the NIH while I was still with the agency. And I'd done some research on what type of technologies have come back to health? And that's how I learned about this one. When NASA first was incepted and they were flying the first men into space, they had put out a call and said, American companies, we need a way to figure out how to get basic vital signs from the astronauts, blood pressure, heart rate, things like that. That didn't exist. If you were in a hospital and you needed vital signs taken, then the doctor had to come to you to take those vital signs or the nurse. and the medical staff. And so they said, we don't just need it in the hospital, we need it from Earth into space. And so a company, two gentlemen came and said, we can do that for you, and developed a way to get those vital signs from space down to Earth. But the more miraculous thing is then they said, wait, if we can do it from space to Earth, can't we do it from the nurse's station to the hospital room? And that is how we have vital sign monitors in hospitals. They went to the LA hospitals and said, look, we just developed this for the government. We think we can do it for your hospital. And the hospitals in LA said, okay, let's give it a go. And that is how you end up with those monitors hooked up to you, and the nurses no longer have to come to you. But if something happens, if your heart stops, they get notified at the nurse's station because of this technology. And it was all because our government invested in solving a problem that was required for the space program, but could come back to benefit us here on Earth.
It's a pretty good answer. Pretty good
Yeah,
answer.
it's one of my
Necessity
favorites.
of invention here. Last question here. Last question before we wrap this up. Why were you one of these little girls, young women, now full adults who never stopped sort of looking at the stars? Why didn't you transition? Because your family was not like you came from a family of astronauts here. I mean,
No.
what drove you?
What drove me? The unknown, exploring what lies that you can't see and that what we don't already know. I think it still drives me today, David. Just being able to learn more and discover more and answer questions that we don't already have answers to. I don't know. It's so fun. And I see it in my kids too. I now have the privilege of being a parent to three kids, and I can see that curiosity in them too, the same curiosity I used to have. I don't know if it's genetic or if it's environmental, probably a combination, says the scientist in me, a combination of
Yeah.
who you're around and what you're around, and who you are on the inside. But there's something so motivating about asking questions that no one else has ever asked before, and then going and finding the answer in a methodical way. I love the scientific method or the engineering design process. One
Right.
of my favorite things.
I mean, the sense of exploration, there are always some kids that just have to leave their hometown.
Yes. That's the best way to put it. I loved my hometown, but I always had this yearning to leave and go find what else was out there. What was it like to live in a bigger city? What was it like to live in a different state? What if I changed regions? That's so funny you say it that way, because that's exactly how you can track my life.
All right. Well, you tossing back today is a good way to wrap this up. So, Dr. Mamta Patel Nagaraja, former NASA Associate Chief Scientist for Exploration and Applied Research. It was an absolute pleasure having you on the show.
Same, likewise. Thank you so much, David, for having me.
Now for Space Takes, where our hosts tackle the buzziest industry topics.
Mike, how's it going? What do we have going on this week?
Let's talk this week about refueling, which is this is a topic that's come up for a long time. Most
Sexy
recently,
topic, mind you.
right? This came up with one of the Space Force leaders who said he didn't really see a clear advantage to refueling, and he's made this is Lieutenant General Sean Brenton. He's made similar remarks in years past. The Chief of Space Operations, General Chance Saltzman, he's questioned, is it more effective to service satellites in space or on orbit, or simply send up a new one? And there's this debate that's been going on for a long time. And we've seen companies that they think there could be a good business model. There's lots of experimental work going on. I was struck by these remarks in part because of something that we've talked about recently the last couple of years, which is if you have the capability to go up and refuel a satellite, there's probably some other capabilities there as well that maybe are potentially more nefarious. And so I was really curious about these remarks in part because Space Force has been, so open, particularly the last couple months, about saying, hey, we need more of these dual use technologies. We're looking at dual use technologies a little bit more. And obviously they're not going to say this is what we're doing or this is what we want to use. But man, refueling to me looked like the type of thing that could be incredibly helpful as we talk a little more openly about a war fighting domain.
Yeah. It's interesting in the sense that I think when people hear the term refueling, they think of fighter jets being refueled over the Indian Ocean or the Pacific
Right.
or something to that effect that sort of
That
extend.
amazing precision that requires.
Right, but also just like the nature of how it works, right? So like that aircraft use constant fuel and constant power to and by refueling them, you extend your range and your reach. And that's not exactly analogous to what happens on orbit, right? And because it's just, we're talking about sort of not necessarily extending missions per se, but in terms of life extension. So it's not like traveling in distances from point A to point B, where like that range directly limits sort of the mission success, but it's just it's just the nature of being already in an operational altitude, following a predictable orbital path to some extent. You can make adjustments and and get out of the way in terms of debris or ASATs or anything of that sort. But they're using fuel really to make orbital adjustments and collision avoidance and evasive maneuvers. So it's different in that
Right.
context. Whereas like refueling, I think when it comes to aircraft, very clear why that's important on the battlefield.
Right.
Maybe not as much on orbit. I wonder if that's what General Saltzman is essentially getting at, which is sort of like we have these terms that sometimes are applied in aerospace, terrestrially, and they sometimes seem interchangeable, but it's just such a different domain up there. And so
Yeah. I
when
mean, I was thinking about it in terms of, almost like a car broken down on the side of the highway. Well, they ran out of gas. Too bad. Like the car's done. You can't use it anymore. And that's not really exactly what's happening. And in fact, the Space Force has said that it's not for a lack of fuel that some of their satellites are no longer working or don't have a longer life. There are other issues there. So this is not some kind of way to solve all these problems and all of a sudden get years or decades more out of a satellite that has already had a good life.
But then maybe they don't even want extra life, to be
Yep.
honest. I mean, and I think that's kind of the interesting thing about all this is that, you know, on the one side, it seems to be software that is really sort of driving the advancements in a lot of this stuff. So this is sort of the counter argument to what I'm about to say, because you can do patches and,
Yep.
those types of patches kind of change the very nature of what a satellite can do. That being said, you have to think like as are these technological advances start to improve both with the intersection of AI, quantum, like our material science understanding of how to put things on orbit and what they're composed of changes. You add that in terms of rocket reusability and the revolution that we've already seen.
Yep.
Does the military want to be relying on something that's like 5 years old or 6 years old on orbit? I'm
10
not.
years old, 20 years old. I mean,
Right.
that's been the case. And, for that's in part what's driven this commercial, use your favorite word there, Renaissance, revolution, whatever you want to choose. But the problem was, particularly for the military, it was taking years, pushing to decades to design a system, get it launched, get the entire constellation on orbit. And by the time it was up there, it was, potentially 15 years old, and that was too long. So I think that's a fair point. Like, would refueling just keep older systems up there at the cost of having something legitimately newer and better?
But the other side of this thing too, and maybe not the other side, but like the bigger picture that I'd be curious to get a sense of this is what the way you're looking at this. Because like when I saw this, my mind is just my gears are kind of turning in terms of like what this means in the aggregate, what it means long term in terms of the broader, I hate to use this term, paradigm shift that we've seen. But like if we see this starting to happen, refueling, it it represents, en masse, not just sort of isolated companies
Yeah. And for the military.
and for the military. I wonder if it sort of represents a little bit of a sort of a Rubicon that's been crossed in terms of, when governments and businesses start putting up the kinds of services up there that can extend life and be expanded upon rather than just sort of a launch and replace, does that mark a moment where we're starting to see not only like this exponential expansion of space assets that we've already seen, but a fundamental rethinking of how we approach machines on orbit. And so, this debate of question of who moves first, subsidized federal funded DoD customers or a commercial effort first. I mean, that's kind of an age-old debate. Um, but like the nature of funding, commercial funding, federal funding that extends the beginnings of a space servicing sort of nascent economy on orbit would be a market departure in terms of what we've seen. It has all kinds of
Oh, yeah.
implications. We talk about, dual use. It has all kinds of implications in terms of the development of perhaps even a space for space economy. And we might be getting a little bit ahead of ourselves in this, but like these are the pieces that you're going to need to accomplish that.
Yeah. I don't, as you were saying that, I was just thinking of the story of the Three Little Pigs, and it's like it sounds like almost like, hey, you're going from a house made of straw to a house made of brick, and we'll see what comes after that. But it gets sturdier and sturdier and stays longer and longer. But uh, there, there there's a big bad wolf coming, and it's going to be a warfighting domain. So
This,
let's move to our next story, which is something that talks about the 60s, 70s, 80s. Why don't you kick this one off?
I love this story. I just love it because I love space history in a sense. But
Yeah.
we're talking about what happened just this week, the Soviet era Cosmos 482. This was a Venus lander. That's what the Venera program essentially means. But this was a craft that was launched back in the 70s that was meant to land on Venus. It did not. Others did, right? And this is the kind of the interesting thing in this is that the Soviets landed on Venus and sent some of the first images back. They're like these yellow landscapes, this cracked, this alien world that we had never seen before. But like the kind of advances that the Soviets were doing all the way back in the 1970s is just remarkable in terms of what's happening now. But this Cosmos 482 Venus lander didn't make it. It had an uncontrolled re-entry that was confirmed by the Russian Space Agency as well as the EU. And the Russians indicated it came down over the Indian Ocean. This was like 53 years after
Yeah.
launching, and it crashed down. Um, and it's one of these things that when you think about our current exploration efforts and the current commercial efforts, pushing into some of these different celestial bodies. I mean, Rocket Lab specifically, we've had Peter Beck on this shows talking about just the nature of how difficult that is now, let
Yep.
alone half a century ago. And just the nature of the Venusian air, atmosphere and how much pressure and heat and all these other things. And so this half a ton structure that had to be about as durable and perhaps about as most Soviet thing possible looking, like this metal ball that had to withstand that pressure to kind of take images and send back readings, crashed down. Fortunately, no one was hurt in that reentry, but it also just kind of reminded me of that conversation we had with Peter Beck. Rocket Lab has that MIT mission that they're hoping to sort of probe the atmosphere there and sort of looking for evidence of life and sort of microbes there. But, this is a company that's not only doing that type of thing, but they're also making real headway in terms of their launch services. And I mean, maybe that's a good place to hand it over to you in terms of what they're doing with Neutron and specifically with the military.
Yeah, I mean the story with Rocket Lab most recently was this cargo test that they're going to be doing, a survivability experiment that's going to be Neutron's first launch. It's going to carry a payload that will re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. And what they're hoping it'll do is demonstrate the ability to safely transport and deploy cargo. So it's it's that's a big ask. It's an experimental contract. It's through the Air Force. It's obviously Rocket Lab um, has the launch pad there at Wallops and in New Zealand. They're gonna continue developing their rocket, but this is something again that's been talked about for the last couple of years. Where kind of the theme today, I think, is a little bit of emerging technology. How does this work? When does it make sense to use rockets to transport equipment, weapons? So we'll see. It's going to be
Personnel?
yeah, first
Yeah.
that's a real
There's been talk about
that
Starship being used in that capacity at one point.
yeah, but it's the speed that becomes really attractive. And The Commandant of the Marine Corps a couple of years ago used to talk about the fight to get to the fight.
Right.
And I think this is a good example of what kind of technology may be necessary to get there in the future.
It's interesting that in the context not only of that, but in terms of the nature of warfare, I think also because perhaps decreasingly there'll be a reliance on the sort of human personnel and the soldiers as we've seen them, and a greater primacy on machines that we've already seen in the battlefields of Ukraine with all kinds of new technologies, companies like Boston Dynamics and others in terms of robotics, the drone warfare that we've seen, and so the delivery of mechanized equipment and cargo via a rocket cargo program or via Starship may be more palatable. The first thing I would think of is like if you're gonna, throw the 101st on a Starship and send them to XYZ country in the course of 30 minutes, how do you get them down? It just seems like the nature of like a rapid deployment is, that's a technological feat in and of itself. But when you look at Rocket Lab, they're really making a play now in terms
Yep.
of the primacy of SpaceX. They're talking about these contracts with the military. We've mentioned the Venus mission. They put in a bid for the Mars sample return in terms of the private side of these things. Pete Warden, former director at Ames, described Peter Beck as one of the best engineers, if not best engineer that he'd ever met. So this
Yep.
is like a company that I think is starting to increasingly become more part of just the layman understanding of what space looks like. And it's not necessarily a domain that's inherently dominated by SpaceX long term if this keeps pace. I don't know. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's hard to catch up with SpaceX given how far ahead they are with Starlink and the launch cadence. But you're talking with Peter Beck, and he describes it not as a launch company, talking about a space company here. And so infrastructure building, launch, satellites, missions to Venus, Mars,
Well, and
all
they
the time.
talked this week about their recent acquisition of Mynaric and how that could help
Right.
building building some of those constellations out. So yeah, I think you're right. Are they're building the full package. They're looking at it in a very holistic way. Great. Well, next week I'm going to be at GeoInt. We'll be recording live there for 4 days or 3 days in St. Louis. And so I hope you tune in to see what's happening at that show. Thanks so much for joining us this week. If you have thoughts on, hey, what should happen next with refueling, or whether or not a cargo test has a future for the Pentagon, we'd love to hear about it. We're at spaceminds@spacenews.com. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Mike Bruce.
And I'm David Ariosto. You've been watching and listening to Space Minds.